Welcome back, class. This is part 2 to the microeconomics class that would be ordinarily held on Thursday, April 7th, 2022. What I want to look at now is corporate structure, to the extent that it is regulated by the Securities and Exchange Commission and FTC when it comes to to trade and to um, the level of competition that takes place within the industry in which the corporation competes. Just as a reminder, you know, we have pure perfect competition, which its its salient characteristics are easy ingress to the market, no differentiation of product or service, and as a result, the only way the entities compete is with price. Usually, when we talk about profits in pure perfect competition, we're talking about profits that are really minimal profits, because what does happen in pure perfect competition, whether it be with subchapter C corporations or whether it be with sole proprietorships, the characteristics are nevertheless still the same. What does happen is this, is that notwithstanding the fact that for the most part, survival is difficult in pure perfect competition, and that there's usually a turnover of firms. There's easy ingress and there's easy egress from the market. Now, depending upon the level of managerial efficiencies that a particular firm has undertaken in terms of its structure, its corporate structure, its managerial structure, um, and the efficiencies that arise therefrom. It is totally conceivable that a remarkably efficient firm can survive in pure perfect competition, and the way and prosper, at least for some period of time. For example, let's just say you have a firm who has scales of efficiency that are generally superior compared to many of its competitors in the in the competitive market of open competition. And let's say you have a firm that is making, minimal profits, and then suddenly that firm hits its break even point. Now, firms that are run efficiently, or a firm that is run efficiently, can maintain itself for a period of time, keeping its head above water and utilizing that period of time, that break-even point in the market, as a way of buying time for much of its competition to drop below the break-even point and reach their shutdown point. Remember, at a break-even point, you go from being profitable, even if it's minimally profitable, to a point where, generally speaking, your fixed costs are being paid. In terms of variable costs, remember, when businesses are generally prosperous, variable costs have a tendency to rise commensurate with the level of production. Variable costs have a tendency to decrease when firms are in a period of survival. That firm, if it keeps its scales of efficiency, is going to be around at a point in time when its competition in that open market, for perfect competition is tough, reach their break even point, suddenly hit their shutdown point, and exit the market. For a relatively abbreviated period of time, that firm, because of its managerial expertise, in the market, will actually switch from being a price taker to a price maker. And I say it's an abbreviated period of time because when that firm or any other firms that have scales of efficiency due to managerial expertise shift from price takers to price makers, it's those attractive profits that are going to attract other firms into that market. And once again, when you start having more and more competition going into the market, prices again will begin to go down, and that cycle repeats itself. You know, a good management team, nevertheless, can keep that entity afloat and at their break-even point without dropping to their shutdown point. So you also have monopolistic competition. Monopolistic competition, I'm not saying that price is irrelevant. Price is always relevant, but really, in monopolistic competition, what you have a monopoly on is a very high level of differentiation in terms of your product or your service. In essence, you have a niche market. And again, whether you're a sole proprietorship, partnership, subchapter C corporation, you can experience monopolistic competition. If you remember oligopoly, where you have a few big competitors that have substantial market share. You have 5, 6 competitors, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less. And And oligopoly results in one of two results. One result is that the firms very vigorously and in a robust manner compete. And that's ultimately, when you start talking about the Federal Trade Commission, that's, they have a great interest in that level of competition. Or what the firms do, rather than, compete in a robust manner, they they collaborate in a robust manner and wind up uh, more or less price fixing and dividing up markets. They operate very much like a cartel. I mean, technically speaking, if you look at OPEC is a wonderful example of a cartel. You know, the oil producing nations that are members of OPEC, for all intents and purposes, they should be involved in vigorous competition. But instead, they're actually involved in very vigorous collaboration with each other, where production is being is set, whether it's going to be tweaked up, whether it's going to be tweaked down, and they're looking to titrate price, negative or positive, up or down. And then of course we have monopoly. And monopoly, where it does exist, more often than not, it's due to impediments, high startup costs, high infrastructure development of competitors entering the market. And what does happen is that monopolies in that sphere of existence, where they do exist, are more often than not very heavily regulated. Like, public utilities are a good example. So remember, when we're talking about corporate structure and management, and we look at the forms of competition, um, it's not just subchapter C's that compete in those manners. All of the other different forms of businesses do so. Um, they're just not as noticed. When something happens, when there's an FTC violation or an SEC violation with a subchapter C corporation, it has a tendency, to be blurted all over the media, and everybody becomes very much aware of it. But what distinguishes subchapter C corporations in their competitive venture from other forms of business is that there is a detachment, a separation of ownership from management. And that ownership is shareholders who elect a board of directors, who in turn hire upper level management, CFOs, CEOs, and so forth. Now, this is not the first time, if you look at subchapter C corporations, that just the corporate form by itself created a fissure between ownership and management. I mean, if you go back to the rail system after the Civil War, when we basically began to use uniform gauge throughout the country. Management was was also separated from ownership and done many times at long distances. For example, you may have a manager in a rail company that's situated in New York and is managing people in Philadelphia and Ohio, as well as New York. If you look at business as a discipline, it was with that separation of ownership and management that came about because of the rail system, where managers were not only separated from owners, but also were separated from their subordinates. And that's where management as a discipline began to be organized into an academic pursuit. Um, Today, one of the problems that exists, and it's not a new problem, but the agent principal fissure that takes place between the board of directors, whether they're inside directors or outside directors, CEOs, CFOs, and so forth, and shareholders. You know, in essence, the board of directors and upper level management are fiduciaries. And a fiduciary has a lot of responsibility, in essence, to act on behalf of a third party. Um, when I say act on behalf of a third party, what's intrinsic to their conduct as fiduciaries is that they put the interests of the principals above their own interests. Now, in theory, that is supposed to be the way the relationship between shareholders, the board of directors, and upper management takes place. Upper management and the board of directors are fiduciaries acting in the best interest of their owners, of the entity, the shareholders. It doesn't always happen that way, because you got to remember, you know, many times in a publicly held and publicly traded corporation, um, ownership interest is very diffused. It's spread amongst many different shareholders. And of course, with common stock holders can always, they can always vote when it comes time to vote for the board of directors. Um, they may not be as attentive as they should be when it comes to the actions of the board of directors and when it comes to the actions of upper level management. And you see this today in many instances where uh, the board of directors and upper management start speaking in terms not of shareholder interests, but stakeholders' interests. Now, Who are stakeholders? Obviously, employees could be stakeholders, customers could be stakeholders, you know, wherever the business is situated, the situs of the business, um, and its varied locations, they could be stakeholders. And you start to begin to see a very diluted managerial philosophy when you start introducing all of these different constituencies as stakeholders in into what the board of directors and upper management should be considering. I mean, in essence, it is a breach of fiduciary duty. They owe a fiduciary duty, a direct line of privity between themselves as board of directors or upper management to their shareholders. To their shareholders. What is the value of being a shareholder if your interests are going to be trumped by other non-shareholding interests, meaning what's known today as stakeholders? You know, as you go through courses, and yeah, you will hear this. I mean, this is what's in vogue today. Business, the interest of shareholders is actually being poo-pooed, and what's being replaced is stakeholders. There is a sense of collectivism, a pernicious sense of collectivism, when you start speaking in terms of stakeholders over shareholders. What happens is ownership interests are actually dismissed. You start looking at the corporation not in terms of a profit making entity, but some type of dynamic, supercharged social working entity. Now, you make up your own mind. I mean, I was educated at a time where, shareholder interests were first, last, and always, because that was they were the owners. Today that has flipped. That has flipped. You're finding that management has a profound interest in what we know as stakeholders, and sometimes they're not always so identifiable. Now, the agent principal dilemma always exists. I mean, it's nothing new where, agents acted not in the best interests of their principals, meaning, the board of directors and upper management can basically, not in a pernicious way, but in a somewhat self-serving way, over reward themselves with very attractive compensation packages and also golden parachute packages. I mean, it's only in the corporate world where an upper level manager could really screw things up and wind up actually prospering with a golden parachute. That's the traditional, long held problem of having a separation, a detachment from ownership and management, the classical agent principle problem. Are the agents acting in the best interest of the principals? Do they always, or do they deviate some of the time? And very obviously, they deviate some of the time. Today, the agent principal problem is much different. It's much different. Because once you start interjecting the interests of these multifaceted groups as stakeholders, then the privity that would run from shareholders to the board of directors to upper management somehow or another gets severed. And along with shareholders' interests, somewhere's floating in there, you have stakeholders' interests. You make up your own mind. My job is just to point out to you this, what I see to be a glaring contradiction of what a fiduciary should be doing. And it's so different from the long established tendency for directors and upper management to be self-serving and not always look out as primarily for the interest of the shareholders. And now suddenly we have a new group that creates all these other additional lines of privity that run from these groups. And of course, shareholders may be part of that, to the directors and management. It becomes confusing, it becomes chaotic, and many times it creates an environment where the agents don't know whose interest they should be acting on behalf. My preference, and it's only my preference, you make up your own mind, is that they should be acting only on behalf of the shareholders and really no one else. Because what happens is eventually, when you really think about what what equity financing is in terms of shareholder interest, that once that becomes diminished, why hold shares in the company? Why hold shares? Because your interests are not first and foremost. They may be secondary or they may be tertiary to this other grouping of interests that's being dubbed today stakeholders. So, again, as you go through your education, just be cognizant that this notion of stakeholders is something that's, very proximate in time. It is not there, there's not a well established history of corporate governance taking into consideration all of these sometimes very polarized interests, as opposed to looking at the shareholders. You can have shareholders filing litigation, and it just leads to unproductive considerations of what are the goals of the business, and what are the interests of the principals, and what are the interests of the agents. In terms of the separation, as I mentioned before, it from a historical perspective, it really started with the railroads. Once the rails became established with that uniform gauge, that's where we began to see separation. It probably could even be discerned that in the Industrial Revolution you began to see a fissure between ownership and management. Meaning, once an economy where the firms were primarily artisans, sole proprietors, partnerships, involved in customized production or customized delivery of a service, to mass production, you would also, inherent in that mass production, you would begin to see a managerial class arise. So it's not just the railroads. It was just the general trajectory of where the nation was going in terms of corporatization. Businesses were being changed from being very uniquely produced products to mass production. Now, one of the ways of at least reining in the agent principal dilemma is to tie upper level management, their compensation packages, to the firm's level of productivity, meaning they're paid in shares of stock, they have stock options, and this does in many ways redirect their interests where there's a nexus of interest between shareholders' interests in success of the entity and upper level management's interest in success of the entity. For example, it's really no different when you say you take a CFO or a CEO and you tie their compensation packages in large part to performance of the entity that they're managing. Why do businesses have profit sharing with their employees? Because what the business wants to do is to tie the interest of the employees with that of ownership. It's kind of like halfway between wage efficiency and working purely on a commission. That's really what it's like when you have a profit sharing plan. Remember, wage efficiency is meant to tether the employee to the firm. In essence, unless they're going to go vertically somewhere else, any horizontal movement in the industry will result in lesser income. Thus, wage efficiency creates that nexus for performance. The same can be said in terms of profit sharing. Outcomes and results and success, those interests are shared with ownership and its employees. Another way of very directly tying performance of the employer, the employing entity, to that of employees, including managers, is they work purely on commission. If you're working purely on commission, it's all about performance. It's all about performance. Less performance, less income. More performance, more income. So there's always an array of situations where you can address the principal agent problem with commission schemes. And I don't mean schemes as a pejorative. Stock option schemes, pay in stocks, wage efficiency. These are all methods where you're trying to build a nexus of interest and cooperation, where you will create internal efficiencies in the given firm. Thus, you have a better chance of surviving, especially if the firm is operating in pure, perfect competition. Now, when it comes to publicly held and publicly traded corporations, needless to say, they have an obligation to divulge to the Securities and Exchange Commission, and in some instances also the FTC, their financial status. Now that's done basically with three mechanisms. One is the financial statement, sometimes known as profit and loss statement. The balance sheet, which the balance sheet shows at any specific period of time what the firm's assets are and what the firm's liabilities are at that given time. Again, that's not, nothing contained therein the profit and loss statement, financial statement, is static. That changes. Likewise, the balance sheet changes. And of course, the cash flow. Cash flow, again, is of extraordinary importance. You can have a business that engages in a tremendous amount of sales, but if those sales result in uncollected accounts receivables, you're not you're not doing anything. But when it comes to publicly held and publicly traded corporations, yeah, it is very important that they dot their I's and cross their T's. Now, all businesses use these devices and these mechanisms to show whether they're profitable, or, and in what areas they're profitable. Even a sole proprietorship will use these same devices through their accountants. They're not required to, however. Now, when it comes to publicly held, publicly traded corporations that are submitting documentation to the SEC, they have to use generally accepted accounting principles, meaning those principles have a uniformity of meaning and definition and purpose in putting these documents together. Now, in many respects, the regulatory apparatus is reactive. For example, you're probably familiar with WorldCom and Enron, which were both entities that involve different areas of fraud, purposeful misrepresentations of fact, um, and made their companies look a whole lot better than what they really were. As co-conspirators were accounting firms that, just as a way of getting business and doing business, really played fast and loose with numbers and how they, and the nomenclature in which they categorized certain monies. And they painted a picture that was very attractive to the public. And thus, in essence, you could say they misled shareholders. As a result, you had Sarbanes-Oxley, which temporally speaking, like followed Enron. And Sarbanes-Oxley created criteria, and of course, a clear promulgation of public policy that publicly held and publicly traded firms have to use generally accepted accounting principles. Also, the auditing function from the accounting function, the everyday accounting function, had to be separated out from the firms, and the upper management CFOs, CEOs also had to be individual signatories to any documentation that is being submitted to the Securities and Exchange Commission, which of course is being used as by the public. Also, the information that's contained in a firm's prospectus, they had to assert that it was true. And one of the reasons they did this was, in a corporation, you know, especially a publicly held and publicly traded corporation, departmentalization not only creates great efficiencies when it comes to expertise, it also creates, and this is on the pernicious side, an environment of plausible deniability. Meaning, things can be done well within the knowledge of upper management and executed by middle management. And upper management can say, this is a shame, this is atrocious, this is wrong, but I didn't know anything about it. Thus, I can potentially escape uh, maybe some criminal liability that may be there. That was closed up with Sarbanes-Oxley. It was closed up with Sarbanes-Oxley. And hopefully, we won't see a repeat of Enron or WorldCom. I mean, what happened, with the real estate market and the real estate bubble had there were some different dimensions there, which we will get into. But WorldCom and Enron were some pretty serious oversteps. So again, keep in mind, as an economic unit, the firm can create great efficiencies. The firm can also create an environment for, some type of misconduct. And that could very well be plausible deniability, especially when you're talking about large institutions, subchapter C corporations. You'll see over time, there was the enactment of the responsible corporate officer doctrine. And the responsible corporate officer doctrine was also a reaction to the notion that there are such departmental separation from the everyday operations and upper management, that upper management was always in a position to deny, again, to use plausible deniability, especially in situations where there was corporate criminal wrongdoing. Oh my God, this shouldn't have happened. I'm sorry, but I didn't know anything about it. Therefore, I'm not criminally liable. And most of the time, what you do find is in the criminal law, whether it's on the state level or federal level, the criminal law punishes intentions, like purposefully doing something or doing something knowing that it's going to result in something noxious. Or doing something, recklessly, or doing something negligently. Well, what the responsible corporate officer doctrine did was they brought the standard of knowledge of the corporate officer down from being purposeful or knowing to being reckless. And they defined reckless as knew or should have known. So if it was in the purview of your duties as a responsible corporate officer to know and you didn't know, But you should have, well, guess what? Plausible deniability will no longer work for you. Also, you saw a change in corporate operations. More, and again, we're really talking about subchapter C's um, in this vein. Um, there was legislation passed um, that I guess it should have been clear to be the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Now, what does the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act prohibit? Well, you know, and I know that if a corporate agent, regardless of the position, but they're acting on the part of the corporation, goes and bribes a public official, they have committed the overt act of bribery. They've offered the bribe. They've usually conspired with somebody up the chain to do that. That's clear. Does that happen sometimes? Yes. Hopefully not a lot. With that said, there was a time and there was a place in American corporate history where it was not uncommon for one of our domestic corporations to look to maybe offshore, opening up a situs in another jurisdiction. And these jurisdictions were many times in Central America, South America, and Eastern Europe. And what it was culturally acceptable to do, because in some of these venues it was, standard operating procedure, was that they would bribe public officials. And when they bribed public officials, they basically got favor. And decisions were made in the favor of the corporate entity. Now, from our perspective, that's inherently devious and distasteful because public officials are really supposed to be looking out for the interest of the public and not really supposed to be looking out for the special interest of people who are willing to pay them a price certain. So now, today, if any agent on behalf of a corporation or any business for that matter, goes into a foreign jurisdiction and in the purpose of furthering the interest of the firm offers a bribe, they have committed a crime and they're under U.S. federal jurisdiction and they will be prosecuted. So you can see that there's a history where government, the regulatory apparatus, whether it be the, say, U.S. Attorney's Office, a state attorney general, a county prosecutor, is based on legislation that was a reaction to abuses. More specifically, Sarbanes-Oxley, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and the Responsible Corporate Officer Doctrine. Now, what happened once again with the debacle that took place with the housing bubble, was, of course, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. That is another administrative agency that's meant to protect consumers. Now, there's an old saying, and you might have heard of it, or your parents might have said it to you. You know, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and there's some credibility to that. And I'll give you an example. Under the Bush administration, the housing and urban development basically took a look-see at lending practices of banking institutions, lending institutions, banks. And what they saw was two things. Really, the banks were kind of cherry picking the top around about quarter of applicants for mortgages. Meaning, like, these people were like almost no risk. I mean, there's no such as, no risk when you're lending somebody money. But again, their asset to income, their, income to debt rate, everything, their FICO scores, their work history, everything was very favorable. And you can almost say that the banks were taking no risk. The second thing the Department of Housing and Urban Development noticed was there was a disparate impact on minorities. Now, disparate impact doesn't mean that you're purposely intending to discriminate, but what it does mean is that notwithstanding your intentions, the criteria that you're using is actually disfavoring minority groups. So what Housing and Urban Development said to the banking industry was, look, let's ameliorate this, loosen up your criteria in terms of lending. And, keep in mind, and the leverage that they used is that the federal government guarantees a lot of the type of the loans that banks make. At one time, the federal government used to even guarantee student loans, but FHA loans are guaranteed. VA loans, Veteran Administration loans, are guaranteed. Small Business Administration loans are guaranteed. That means if the borrower defaults, the bank doesn't suffer negative consequences, the federal government pays. So, as a quid pro quo, the banks loosened their lending criteria. One could say that they went from lending to the top quarter of applicants to the top third. Now, what resulted? Well, there was no appreciable increase in defaults. And, hindsight is always 2020. What the banks realized, given hindsight, was they were actually being too risk adverse and too conservative in their criteria, because a lot of people that they could have lent money to and earned interest on, remember, when a bank makes a loan, it's an asset. So So you didn't have any appreciable increase in defaults. What did happen, and in a very significant way, was the price of housing started shooting up. And, once again, in hindsight, it's all logic. What the lending institutions, banks, and mortgage companies began to appreciate is that the true market for residential housing is not John Q. Public. It's only those people that have a mortgage or that can obtain a mortgage. So once you increased the number of people that were eligible for a mortgage, and you looked at housing as not an exact finite supply, uh, because there's always some turnover of new construction, demolition of old, but it takes time. So even though it's not precisely finite, the housing market is relatively a fixed finite supply. And suddenly you've increased the demand. Again, the true market, the demand function for housing is only those people that qualify, or if you don't qualify for a mortgage, you can pay cash. And I'm sure there's not a lot of people paying cash. So what began to happen was the banks realized a couple of things. One was that they could actually hedge their risk in the event of foreclosure. For example, let's just say in a contracted market where there's very strict lending criteria, if a borrower defaults and the bank has to foreclose, and the bank winds up maybe getting 75 cents on the dollar. Now, there's two types of mortgages, recourse and non-recourse mortgages. With a non-recourse mortgage, the bank can't sue you for the balance. With a recourse mortgage, the bank can sue you for the balance. But generally, when you find people that are at a point where they're defaulting on a mortgage, because mortgages usually have a low rate of default, they're not attractive targets for a lawsuit to recoup those monies. So banks generally, even if there was a recourse mortgage clause, they generally didn't pursue the borrower. So what they found out was, even with the statistically small amount of people that would default, instead of getting 75 cents on a dollar, they were getting 85-90 cents on a dollar. So what they realized was that the more liberal they were in lending, the more they were insulated from loss. So thus, you had an industry that invented the ninja loan, no income, no job verification. That was very, very common. And what the banks would do is, and again, that's not being liberal lending. That's actually being reckless. They would just basically take these mortgages, and it's called securitization, and they bundle the mortgages, and they make a security out of it, an investment vehicle, and they sell it out into the market. Now, I will tell you, the investment vehicle is named mortgage-backed securities. But I will tell you this, mortgage-backed securities have existed since the 70s. Mortgage-backed securities, from an historical perspective, were always thought to be relatively safe investments because, again, statistically speaking, one of the last things that people do is default on their mortgage. And there's two reasons. Number one, it's the roof over your head. And number two, many times you have people, they're many years down the line and they've built equity in their home. And if they default, it's really a horrible situation. So when you look at all the different lending vehicles, how people get financing and credit, mortgages are considered a safe bet because they have a very low incidence of default. So the mortgage-backed security was around for a long period of time and considered very safe. Many people, and I don't know why they get this impression, that the mortgage-backed securities was a creation somewhere in the early 2000s. It wasn't. It was always there. Now, with that said, what the banks would do, loan officers and bank officers in individual banking institutions really did know what the level of risk they were holding. And that the Federal Reserve and the FDIC, they zealously monitor the solvency of banks. So a bank that was engaged in prolific issuance of ninja mortgages, no income, no job verification, knew they had a lot of risk. So what they were doing is no sooner were they issuing these mortgages, as practical as it was, they would bundle them up and sell them out into the securities market. Now, two things happened, and rather in a cascading manner. A lot of these mortgages had very attractive teaser rates. Some of them were you don't pay your mortgage for the first year, and then an interest rate kicked in, and people weren't really aware of the jump from the teaser rate to the first tier increase in interest. In many instances, you came close to, and in some instances literally doubled what the mortgage payment is for these borrowers. That happened. They faced the reality, I was barely paying this freaking mortgage before. Now it's almost doubled or doubled. I'm out of here. They just walk away and they find recourse in bankruptcy. Now remember, when this is happening, the supply of housing is going up. That structure, that real estate, is now sellable. Another thing that happened was banks were kind of naive. You know, from our past conversations, banks basically make money two ways. They take in deposits and they pay us a meager interest rate, and they take these monies and they make loans. Those are deposits, are liabilities. Those loans are bank assets. They make money by making loans. Secondarily, banks have very extensive investment portfolios with usually very safe, because again, the FDIC and the Federal Reserve really do keep an eye on the solvency of banks, individual banks. What would happen unwittingly, just say I'm a bank and I'm making ninja loans. I go, I engage in securitization. I bundle these mortgages, and boom, and I say, thank God I got rid of that crap. Somebody else in the banking that I work is in charge of like investments. Well, they go out in the market and they're buying securitized mortgages, mortgage-backed securities. And guess what? Other banks are doing the same thing. So unbeknownst to my institution, what I spun off as crap and sold to somebody else, somebody in my institution is buying somebody else's crap that they spun off and now we bought. So as these teaser rates began to kick in, you started to see like the momentum of defaults and foreclosures and defaults and foreclosures. And suddenly the banks were in such a precarious situation where they had still, within the confines of their institution, ninja mortgages, no income, no job verification. They didn't securitize them yet. They're still there. They're about to securitize them, but they're still there. And at the same time, they bought mortgage-backed securities that are chock full of, defaulting mortgages. That was the prelude to the collapse of the banking system. The first thing you saw happen was the FDIC insurance went from $100,000 per account up to $250,000 per account. And as a result, I mean, yes, like they were bailed out, and I mean, they were bailed out basically. The government bought preferred stocks in the bank. Remember, why preferred stocks? Because you get a definite return on investment and you don't have voting rights. If the government bought common stock, that would be tantamount to a government takeover of the banking system. So they didn't want that, and they also wanted their money back and with a return on investment. That's the TARP, Troubled Asset Relief Program. The government was paid back all its money and actually made money on the TARP bailouts. The problem is, from a policy perspective, is that they set a very iffy precedent. And again, when I say iffy, I mean very risky. The concept is too big to fail. If you're too big to fail and you're a CFO or CEO of a particular bank, and you know that, you fall into that category, well, you could be really cavalier and reckless. And if you go under, you'll get your golden parachute and the institution will be bailed out by Washington, D.C. Now, that really hasn't, thus far, you got to remember, between 2004 and December of 2008, this is where a large part of these mortgages started to default and there were foreclosures. And now, it hasn't repeated itself, but the precedent is there. There is a school of thought, and it's kind of free market social Darwinian that says, hey, look, you screwed up, you made mistakes. Therefore, it's in the interest of the general economy that the weakness of these institutions, they should be allowed to fail and to be purged from the competitive market. Thus, the economy, notwithstanding some tumultuous times in the short run, in the long run, they would be better off because these offending institutions that were inefficient actually failed. The risk, of course, there is that, it could have a ripple effect. I mean, we could tilt into a depression. The world could tip into a depression. And thus, notwithstanding, maybe setting a bad precedent when it comes to banking policy, too big to fail, it basically was an emergency stopgap in terms of a collapse of the banking system and ultimately the economy. Counterfactuals are always hard to prove. Well, what if we didn't have TARP? What would have happened? Well, some people, and maybe very correctly, would point out to literally years of awful economic times. But those same people may also point out is that the inefficiency in the banking system would have been purged, and the correct precedent, which would act as a prophylaxis against abuse recklessness and cavalier behavior on the part of bank management, um, um, the precedent would have been different. Uh, when I come back, which will be next week, and I don't want this surgery. I want the surgery like a hole in the head. But that's the problem. I got a hole in my leg. Um, we will view The Big Short, and we will have some follow up, discussion about this issue. But I think The Big Short is very illuminating, in terms of what happened and some of the reasons why. And what I want to talk about as a follow up to viewing The Big Short is the concept of regulatory capture, which did play some role in how all of this did actually transpire and occur. One of the things that you should recognize is that in many of these instances, WorldCom, Enron, the housing bubble, um, government was not proactive, it was reactive. Is that the proper public policy stance to take? Now, we had the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau um, come out of this debacle. And I'll tell you, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau really tightened up the real estate market that, at one time it was almost impossible for people to get loans. The Trump administration did loosen that up a little bit, but no sooner was that loosened up than you started hearing rumors of the ninja loan coming back into play. The veracity, the truth of that, I don't know. That would be the first time is a mistake, the second time is a choice. But we will talk about this a little bit further after we view The Big Short. Listen, the code word for part 2 of this lecture is baseball cards. So the first part was TOPS, TOPPS. Part 2 is baseball cards. Google it and you'll see what I'm talking about. Listen, everybody have a good week. I will see you next week, hopefully with 2 legs. Bye-bye now.